Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washingtech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washingtech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
The D.C. Circuit upholds the FCC's net neutrality rules, Apple refuses to fund the GOP convention, and Victor Yocco is my guest. The net neutrality rules the FCC passed in February of last year are here to stay. Those rules prevent internet service providers, ISPs, from prioritizing their own content, such as programming they license from channels like Fox News over other content, such as Netflix or YouTube, traveling over the internet. A 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit upheld the rules in a 2-1 vote Tuesday in a decision that affirms the Federal Communications Commission's treatment of broadband internet service as a utility, thereby empowering the Commission to regulate internet service providers. Some experts think this decision paves the way for the FCC to regulate things like the pricing of broadband. Craig Moffett, a prominent analyst with Moffett-Nathanson, told Cecilia Kang at the New York Times that the decision has, quote, swung the pendulum in that direction. Advocates, the Commission, and lobbyists have been fighting over net neutrality rules for over a decade, and last week's D.C. Circuit opinion all but lays the issue to rest. The telecommunications industry has vowed to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court, but some scholars and advocates don't think the court will even hear the case. Former FCC Chairman Reed Hundt told the Center for Public Integrity that the sole dissenting judge, Stephen Williams, agrees with the FCC's authority to treat broadband as a utility, and that he just thinks the FCC failed to, quote, properly explain why it did so. So several advocates on both sides of the debate say there is no legal issue for the Supreme Court to take up. The Center for Public Integrity has a full analysis of the chances that the Supreme Court will hear this case, and Cecilia Kang and Brian Fung have excellent coverage of this decision in the New York Times and Washington Post, respectively. Apple has joined several other companies, including BuzzFeed, Wells Fargo, and Ford Motor Company, and announced that it will not be supporting the GOP convention on account of Donald Trump's comments about women, immigrants, and minorities. Apple CEO Tim Cook will, however, be hosting a fundraiser for House Speaker Paul Ryan, who is a Republican, according to The Hill. Up on the Hill, the Senate Commerce Committee passed a bill that would exempt small ISPs, or those with 25,000 or fewer subscribers, from the FCC's Open Internet Transparency Rule, which requires ISPs to provide sufficient information about the broadband services they are purchasing. The FBI has placed countless security surveillance cameras on utility poles around the nation, and last week, a federal judge in Seattle granted a temporary restraining order that will allow the FBI to keep the locations of these cameras a secret. An activist named Phil Mosek used a Seattle public records law to request from the city of Seattle a record of the locations of the cameras the city of Seattle had received from the FBI. The FBI asked for a temporary restraining order, and on Monday, Judge Richard Jones of the Western District of Washington granted it. He wrote, quote, "If the protected information is released, the United States will not be able to obtain its return. The confidentiality of the protected information will be destroyed, and the recipients will be free to publish it or post the sensitive information wherever they choose, including on the internet, where it would harm important federal law enforcement operational interests, as well as the personal privacy of innocent third parties," end quote. David Kravetz at Ars Technica has full coverage. According to The Hill and the Detroit News, the powerful chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Fred Upton, a Republican from Michigan, told a local radio station last week that he has no plans to endorse Trump. Upton said of Trump that he thinks Trump's, quote, train is off the track, end quote, and that maybe the candidate will be able to get it back on track before the election less than 5 months from now. The United States of America has taken the unusual step of requesting to join the case against Facebook, brought by Austrian privacy activist and lawyer Max Schrems in Europe. Schrems believes Facebook's transfer of Europeans' data to the U.S. via its servers in Ireland is unlawful because the European Court of Justice struck down the Safe Harbor Agreement earlier this year. Glenn Moody at Ars Technica UK has full coverage. The New York State Public Service Commission has approved the $17.7 billion acquisition of Cablevision by the European telecom group Altice, clearing the way for the companies to close the deal, which Altice says will happen by the end of the month. The FCC had already approved the deal. John Brodkin at Ars Technica reported last week that cable industry advocates met with FCC commissioners last week to push a compromise on the FCC's set-top box proposal. In the compromise, the industry would be willing to ensure the set-top boxes it deploys to customers have open standards, allowing for the development of third-party apps that customers would choose to access their content. However, the compromise would not include a recording feature, and advocates including John Bergmeyer at Public Knowledge and others say the compromise doesn't go far enough. Check out Ars Technica for more. Finally, there was a bit of movement on cybersecurity and encryption on the Hill last week. On Tuesday, Senators Mark Warner, the Democrat from Virginia, as well as Colorado Republican Cory Gardner, announced the creation of a new cybersecurity caucus, which will keep members up to date on cybersecurity developments. Also on Thursday, CIA Director John Brennan testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee, urging them to create a commission that would investigate how the United States government should deal with encrypted technologies. Brennan said, quote, "The one area when I look to the future that concerns me is the digital domain. I do not believe our legal frameworks, as well as our organizational structures and our capabilities, are yet at the point of being able to deal with the challenges in that digital domain that we need to have in the future," end quote. Julian Haddam at The Hill has more coverage. Stay with us. For Washington Tech Policy Podcast listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You can listen at the gym, in the car, or on your morning run. How about The Industries of the Future by Alec Ross? You can download The Industries of the Future by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book. My guest today is Victor Yocco. Victor is a user experience researcher working for EY Intuitive out of Philadelphia. He has written several articles for the likes of A List Apart and Smashing Magazine, and has recently written a book about user experience research called Design for the Mind, 7 Psychological Principles for Persuasive Design, which will be available this month. He earned both his undergraduate degree and PhD at Ohio State. Please welcome Victor Yocco. Victor, welcome to the show.
Hey, Joe. Thank you for having me today.
Today we're going to talk about user interface design and some of the key psychological principles that you should be thinking about whether you are a web designer or not, when it comes to presenting your website and apps to your audience in a way that inspires them to engage with your content. But my expert today has also been advocating a lot on the role of alcohol in the technology sector, where alcohol abuse has become really de rigueur for many tech professionals. So the topic of how psychology impacts how user interfaces are designed is interesting, but we're also going to look at this other topic, alcoholism, that we don't hear a lot about. So, Victor, I'm so pleased you were able to join me.
Joe, thank you for the great introduction. I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to be introduced to your audience.
So tell us about your background, Victor, some of the obstacles you've encountered, and what led you ultimately to being interested in UX design.
All right. Well, my background is in psychology and communication, really from an academic perspective. The last 10 plus years, I've always had a role doing some type of research with people, and that included going to graduate school and getting my PhD, where I looked at how people interface with exhibits in places like zoos and science centers to learn and take home the messages that those places are really trying to impart on people. So, for example, when you go to a zoo, they want you to have a good experience. Oftentimes people think, we're going to go to the zoo with our families and have a picnic. But what the zoo also would like you to do is walk away with not only an appreciation for the animals that are there, but actually looking deeper into conservation and why we should care about these animals in the wild. And the way they try to communicate that to users or visitors, in their case, is through their different exhibits and the messaging that people encounter, or the educational programming that people encounter. So really, I looked at, how do we frame this messaging? How do we communicate to visitors in a way that's effective in actually making them understand, oh, I visited the zoo, but now I'm going home and I might want to learn more about the plight of the lion in the wild and what my role is in that and how I might be able to help resolve that situation. Mm-hmm. So taking that very broadly, and that's what I was doing, was research and evaluation in those types of settings for a while. And then as I evolved my career options, also I was presented with the opportunity to do what didn't seem like on the surface very similar work, but start doing research on people who were using computer interfaces to accomplish tasks, also called user experience design. And really, once I got there and started doing this work, I realized that other than having a digital interface, the psychology and how we communicate to people in those settings is very similar. So we have websites, we have web applications, we have smartphone applications that we are trying to impart messages to people with. And one of the messages might be buy my product. One of the messages might be use my product. And sometimes the message is simply information or education around a certain issue. But similar to a zoo or a science center, we want to create these experiences to have an impact on people. And the psychology that comes into play as a background to speaking to people, whether it's in a zoo or a science center or on a smartphone application, is very similar. And so I've done a lot of writing about that. And I actually have a book that's coming out in the next month or so, Design for the Mind, where I've written about some of the more popular psychological principles that I'm familiar with and how we apply them to design. And so that's sort of a background in terms of where I'm at today. I do a lot of writing in blogs for the field of digital design, UX design, around the application of psychology and why we should conduct user experience research, which is really getting information directly from your users on whether your product is usable or not, and where you can make some fixes to make it more usable. But when you ask me about what are some of the obstacles I've encountered, like many of us, I've encountered plenty of obstacles, and unfortunately, some of them were self-inflicted. And the one I talk about the most is my abuse and use of alcohol. And so now, currently, I'm over 2 years sober, and that's really where I hit my peak in terms of writing, in terms of writing a book, in terms of my personal and professional life. The last 2 years have been better than the previous 35 combined. And I realized this after 1 year of sobriety, that I needed to start talking about it, because when I looked around, particularly in an agency culture, in the design field, in technology fields, we very much promote the use of alcohol, not only at our events, but in our workplace, which for somebody who's either trying to stay sober or somebody who isn't comfortable around alcohol consumption in general, that creates a setting where you start to feel either excluded or even somewhat tempted if you're somebody who is trying to stay sober and there's constantly alcohol available. And so I started to write as well about that, and it's picked up some interest in terms of what my experience has been, but more focusing on what are some of the simple solutions, because I'm not advocating a ban on alcohol. I don't think we should monitor people's consumption. I don't think that anybody should feel like they can't do what they want to as an adult who makes their own decisions. But I think that and especially after writing and getting a lot of feedback from people, we create a situation where some people either don't feel safe or don't feel comfortable when we heavily promote, oh, you should come to this event because there's going to be an open bar. Mm-hmm. There are other ways to do that.
Or when it's not an open bar and you're like, why isn't it an open bar?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And then so do we know that, right? Is that something that we know not having the open bar is going to turn people off? And if we do, why are we having an event? Is it just for people to come and drink? And so really, I advocate a position of being responsible, but also being very purposeful with our words. So when we talk about events, we also focus on the fact that there is going to be soft drinks available because we want to acknowledge and respect the fact that not everyone's going to be coming to drink. Mm-hmm. Or if our company is hosting an event and we're going to be providing an open bar, are we also providing some type of ride service home, maybe having designated drivers, at least making the fact that not everybody has to drink part of the conversation so that those who choose not to don't feel like they're being different in a bad way or a way that's going to be noticed by everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And I used to drink, 3-4 glasses of wine every night. And, I've since cut back, to 5-ounce glasses. And so now when you quit and you stopped drinking alcohol completely, did you switch to soda, or are you still just sticking to like water and tea and coffee? Because that's kind of a big thing for me. It's like if I wanted to have the sugar, I'd have the sugar, but I don't want that either. So I'm just wondering if that's
that's a great question. Definitely what I did was switch to seltzer water and flavored seltzer water. And so I don't get the calories that I would from soda. And actually, I don't get the calories that I was getting. I was a beer drinker, and it had to be the craftiest craft beer with the highest alcohol content for me to enjoy it. So I was getting, probably well over 1,000 calories a night just from beer consumption based on the amount I was drinking. What I do now, and what I've done since stopping drinking, is ice cold seltzer water. I really like the way it feels, the fizz to it, and the carbonation. It seems to be a good replacement for at least the physical pleasure of the sensation of drinking alcohol that I used to get. I would certainly say that that's been helpful for me. And so your point is a great one, which is like, if you're going to remove this thing that you do, which is drinking a liquid, like should you replace it with something else? And I would say, that it would be helpful for somebody to know something else that might at least take the place of the physical sensation of drinking alcohol. And for me, that was seltzer water. I don't know what would be the equivalent for wine, maybe a nice dark grape juice or something.
Mm-hmm. So now tell us about some of the consciousness raising that you've been doing in the tech sector and what other professionals can learn about managing their own alcohol dependence.
Absolutely, Joe. So, I've been very vocal, but I think that there's a need to continue talking about and sharing my experience and the insights that I've had, because the more I do it, the more I hear from others that it's not so much people are promoting alcohol use because they think that we should all be drunk or drinking. It's more of an awareness thing. People don't inherently know or understand that some of us are out here who either abuse alcohol once we start to use it, or people who are just not comfortable. And when I started writing, so first I've been writing as frequently as I have an opportunity to about what we can do to create our workplaces and our conferences and events make them a little more inclusive for people who choose not to drink. And whenever I publish something, I get emails and feedback from folks. And the thing that surprises me is that besides abusing alcohol, there are so many other reasons that people choose to stay away from drinking or events where everyone else is drinking. And that can be everything from having medical conditions to having had traumatic episodes in their life where people who were drunk abused them or put them in a situation where they don't feel comfortable anymore around other people who are drunk. And the thing with those people who are in those situations, they want to attend these events. They want to feel comfortable at work. And one of the biggest things that causes the discomfort is thinking they might be in the spotlight for not drinking. And so the thing I really advocate and talk about is don't ask people why they're not drinking. If they're not drinking alcohol, it's really none of our business. And it's the same thing as asking them, are you on antipsychotic medication? Are you pregnant? If you wouldn't feel comfortable asking somebody that you really don't know that well those questions, it's essentially the same thing when you ask them why they're not drinking. So I've been doing writing on blogs and any place that would have me publish an article. And I've also been able to get some speaking opportunities around it, which is very exciting to me because I like to talk, I guess. But so I spoke at Drexel University. They had an event, and I was able to give a presentation there around a similar topic of addressing alcohol and how we can create events that are more inclusive and workplaces that are more inclusive. And coming up in July, I'm on a panel, which is going to be local here. I'm out of Philadelphia, a local panel of people who are going to be discussing the broad spectrum of workplace cultural issues. So we're going to be talking about creating inclusive workspaces that are welcoming to minorities, that are welcome to females, that are welcome to people of all genders and ages. And then I'm also going to be on there talking about the role of alcohol as part of workplace culture. And so my hope is just to share the message and really share it in a way that doesn't come across as prohibitionary or we shouldn't be drinking at all or lecturing. I don't want to lecture people. I want to raise awareness, and I want to say what I've wanted to say and been trying to say is, hey, look at me. I'm experiencing a lot of success right now around writing about psychology, about being promoted at work, about my personal life. I'm married and I have a child since becoming sober. And I wouldn't have any of this if I hadn't become sober. You might be in a workplace setting where one of your closest colleagues is abusing alcohol. And if they were to decide to become sober, they're going to need support. They're going to need at least to understand that if they're going to continue working in an environment where alcohol is promoted, that they're not going to be expected to drink, even if they don't want to come out and tell everybody, hey, I'm an alcoholic and I have a problem. And so I really just want to say, like, if you can look at me and say that I'm experiencing this success, then all you have to do is say, I'm aware that there are other people out there who could be experiencing success or greater success in their life. And we just need to support them through making sure our workspaces account for the fact that not everybody is the same shape and size when it comes to drinking.
Yeah. So now let's turn to UX design again.
Gotcha.
For policymakers who aren't aware, can you describe for us what UX design is and why it's important for advocates and others who want to break through that Washington echo chamber?
Sure. So UX design is really a take on design, and usually it's mentioned in digital design circles as of late because everything is very much going towards being digital, either on a website, on a smartphone. But it's designing for products as well, where you take a user-first approach and you think about how your product is going to be used from the perspective of a user. So when we design something, the traditional method is to think about, from the eyes of a designer or an engineer, how do we create this product? Oftentimes, though, designers, people who create products, they don't necessarily think about a product's use the same way as the final end user will. And whether that's because they have a lot more background knowledge and experience, or because their brains are wired differently to consume data and interpret it differently than an end user, what we do know is that people who design are usually very creative and they're great at solving problems. And so they like to wrestle with challenges. However, our end user really probably just wants to open something up and use it. And so for UX design, you start to incorporate the voice of the user from the very beginning. And you do that by collecting data from your users, by informing your design with research, either interviews, or we do a lot of what's called usability testing. And that can be done at any stage of a product's development, where you take your idea out and you start to have your users or people who represent your potential users actually test your design. And if you're creating something like a website, you can do that when you're at the stage of something as simple as black and white wireframes, because really you want to know, are the actions you're asking people to take, do they understand what you're asking them to do? If you're setting up a website, does the content and the way you're labeling your content, is that understandable? Does it immediately grab your user's attention and tell them, if you need to find out more information about topic X, you should look here? Will they understand that just at a quick glance? So it's really reducing the workload on the user. And unfortunately, what that often means then is putting more of the workload on the designer and on the development team, because you're going to have to try to create processes on the back end that make up for reducing the workload on the user on the front end.
And so when it comes to policy and things like white papers and information products like that, would it apply the same way? How would you apply? Because, I mean, I see a lot of white papers and they're published and their funders put a lot of money into it. But then when you go and look and see how often they were shared, it's like nothing. Like,
right.
So how can policymakers improve their user interface design so that it makes it, does this apply to that? I guess.
Yeah, I would say that it applies to that in how you frame your information. If you are creating a white paper on a specific topic and you know the audience that you're creating the white paper for, then you should also start to understand how they consume information. And are you offering the white paper via those channels? So let's say you have people who are more likely to read something on a website. Are you creating the content in a way that actually makes it responsive to the type of screen and device that a user is going to be looking at the paper? Or if you know people are going to be downloading it because it's something that they would want to print out and read later, are you offering that in a convenient and downloadable format? And something that is also going to be really important for a white paper or any type of information, and that I talk a lot about actually in my book, because one of the biggest principles of psychology is how people engage socially. Are you making this available in a way that facilitates social sharing? And so if it's a white paper on a topic that you have a group of people who are looking for more information, are you providing them with options to share? Are you providing them with options to maybe talk about it, facilitate a conversation about this topic, because that's going to draw in more people. And if they're talking about the topic and it's based on this white paper, then it would be logical to think they're going to also want to explore the white paper itself and share that information with others. And so I think there's probably a lot of opportunities to look at how you can facilitate conversation and seed conversation around the topics of the information you have, and then also promote sharing via social media, via sharing links and asking other people to join the conversation, and then also via sharing the actual paper itself through a downloadable file.
Yeah, because when you said wireframes, I just pictured a whole bunch of people in Washington just going, "Oh, please make it stop." But it's good to know that this applies to the policy world as well. But let's talk about your book, Victor,
Sure.
and some of the key arguments you make. What are the 7 psychological principles that people who are developing their sites should incorporate into their design?
Sure. I'll discuss what the 7 principles I cover in my book are. And then I'd also preface that with saying I don't necessarily advocate that everybody has to account for all 7 of the principles. The book covers 7 principles total. And what I advocate is a mixing and matching based on what your needs are, because ultimately what we want to do is create the most useful and usable site or product for people to use. And it might not be one size fits all when it comes to applying the psychological principles. But I'll just briefly walk through each one if you'd like, and talk a little bit about how that applies to site design. So one of the first principles that I talk about in the book is addressing planned behaviors. And that's really about how do people engage in behaviors that they know about ahead of time. And that might be something big like I'm going to purchase a car, or I'm going to make this decision about which movie I see tomorrow night, or which white paper I download. And so how do people plan this behavior, or where I go to look for my white papers? And so I talk about the 3 elements of that, which is showing people that they're in control of the situation. So that would be things like actually having them able to easily find where the white paper is, if that was what they were looking for, and then easily download it. So they're the ones that are in control of whether or not and when they get that information. Showing people that it's a social norm. So designing in a way that shows people that others have done what they're doing, or that others in their circles approve of what they're doing. So saying, this white paper is useful for people in groups like X, Y, and Z, or if you affiliate yourself with this, then you're probably going to be interested in this information. And then also tapping into behavior beliefs, which is whether or not people feel like engaging in a certain behavior is positive or not. So when it's a digital interface, it's how do we show people that the behavior that they're going to engage in is improved or positive through doing it on a website, versus saying like writing and requesting the paper be sent to them through the mail. So in a situation like that, information presentation is critical, and how we show people the ease of access to that information. They're going to plan then for their behaviors to use whichever site is easiest for them to get at those behaviors and accomplish their tasks. Another topic that I cover in the book is what is called in academic circles decision making under risk. And really, it's about mental shortcuts or heuristics that people take. And it's the basic premise is people have a ton of decisions to make, and they don't necessarily have the time or ability to give deep thought into every decision they make. So how do we tap into some of the shortcuts that people make? And some of those include things like, what is the first thing that comes to mind when people are presented with an option for what they need to accomplish? An example I give is many people, the first thing they think of when they think of digital tax software preparation is TurboTax. And that's because TurboTax has done a great job of creating this name recognition in their field, of creating a product that accomplishes what people need it to. So how can you tap into opportunities to make your product like TurboTax and have it be the first thing that comes to people's mind? Or another one is the scarcity effect. People are much more drawn into engaging in a behavior when they feel like what they're doing is, it sets them apart in a positive way, or it's like a premium option. And so how can you create this sort of perception of scarcity? So for a white paper, it may be something like download it now because it might only be available for the next month, or free copy for the first 2,000 downloads. And that's something that make people much more likely. You're not fooling them. It makes them more likely to engage in making the decision now versus putting it off. Another one of the principles is motivation and ability. And that means you need to present somebody with the option to do something when they're highly motivated and they have the ability to do it. So again, using the white paper example, you wouldn't ask someone to download a white paper if you haven't explained to them what it's about, or presented them with the actual paper to download. So you need to think about, when do you do that? You need to explain to them why something is relevant. Then you need to give them the ability to access that information, and then say, okay, do it. There needs to be this call to action in the end, which is called the trigger, where you say, do this thing. But if you say, do this thing, download this white paper too early, people won't, because they're not going to understand either why, or they're not going to understand how. So presenting people with the information that makes it relevant, giving them the ability to do it, and then saying, okay, now I'd like you to do this, is critical. That's another chapter that we discuss in the book. And then I move into talking about influence, which is oftentimes thought of as a negative thing where, oh, you're trying to get me to do something I don't necessarily want to do. Well, I write that influence is much more, it's benign. It's not something that's trying to get people to do something they won't do. It's trying to get people to do something you want them to do because they're going to do that anyway, so they might as well use your product to accomplish that task. So let's say, there was two competing sites offering information. Well, you might want people to come to your site because that's why you have the site versus a competitor's site. And there's principles of influence. And actually, if you're familiar with the book by Carnegie, How to Make Friends and Influence People, or that's something that and I might have incorrectly said the title there. I think
it's like win. It's like
how to win friends and influence people.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about techniques of influence and how to get people to like you. And so it's things like reciprocity. If you give somebody something for free, they tend to feel like they might owe you something back. So let's use the white paper example again. If you give somebody a free white paper and they find value in the information, and then you ask them to, say, sign up for your email list, they're much more likely to do that after they've gotten the white paper and found the value in it, because they're going to feel this sense of obligation that, okay, well, Joe provided me with something very valuable for free. I owe him a favor back. Or it's sort of like you give somebody a gift on their birthday, then maybe you expect that they're going to gift you back on your birthday. So reciprocity is sort of something that has evolved with humans as we've realized, hey, we need to rely on each other and get each other to commit to doing stuff in the future. So giving things and then getting things back in return is one way we deal with that. And that's also where visual influence comes into play. And so like things like using colors and information effectively, using the right fonts to convey professionalism or to convey a sense of urgency, displaying information in a way that is very appealing to users versus just a block of text that people have to squint their eyes at to try to not be distracted from the words around it. So really thinking hard about how we're laying those things out for people to view. And then the book moves into social influence, which is where you actually use other groups and people's identities with groups. So if you think from a political perspective, people have developed social identities around their political affiliations. And so people who might align themselves with a D or an R are more likely to engage in very specific behaviors because it validates their social identity. And so if you were to have a site that you wanted to strengthen people's affiliations with their social identity, you might highlight how other people who are Democrats use the site or other people who are Republicans use the site. And it's actually possible to do that in a way where you appeal to multiple social identities. And one example of that is Facebook. You can be a Democrat or a Republican and use Facebook, and you can use it all day long to be part of your group, and you never have to sort of butt heads with other group members. So Facebook doesn't necessarily mean only Democrats or only Republicans, because you can set up your own topics, because you can form subgroups on there. So how can you think about making your website similar to Facebook in that people can come on and use it and they can affiliate themselves with certain groups, but it doesn't necessarily then exclude other groups because it allows people to have these separate conversations in places where they're comfortable having it.
Got it. That's interesting.
And then one of the principles that I find fascinating, and that's probably my favorite, and it comes from my academic background as well, looking at how we convey information in places like zoos and science centers, is framing communication. And that's really how do we speak to people in a way that makes them feel like the thing we're talking about is relevant to their life. And what I looked at in zoos and science centers was how do we talk about things like water pollution, like air pollution, in a way that's going to resonate with someone who is completely self-centered in a different way than somebody who completely cares about the well-being of their children and future generations. And what I found, and what framing tells us, is you can talk about the same thing in a lot of different ways to make it appeal to somebody and get the same type of behavior. So I might tell you, if I think you're somebody who's very interested in yourself, that you want clean water because you like to canoe, and you won't be able to canoe in clean rivers in 20 years if we don't take care of this water, versus somebody who might be very focused on their children and future generations. I might say, well, your children might want to canoe when they grow up. And so we need to think about what we're doing to make sure our waterways stay relatively clean so that they have the opportunity to do that. And we can do that on our websites too. And you can talk about different issues and policy issues in a way that appeals to conservatives or appeals to very liberal people, in ways that can sort of get people to take the action you want them to take, which would be to vote for a certain way or feel strongly about a certain policy, positively or negatively. And then it just depends on, are you framing the communication in a way that tells this person why it's important to them? And the chapter gets pretty deep into different methods for doing that and different ways of framing messages depending on what the topic is and what you want people to do.
Wow, really stealth information for everybody. If you didn't catch all of it, I encourage everyone to go back and listen so you can hear it again, because it's been really informative, and you'll learn a lot from the different psychological principles that apply when you're developing a campaign to reach different segments of your audience. So, Victor, it's been an absolute privilege having you on the show. So thanks once again for joining me. I just want to ask you a few more questions and then
Sure.
We'll close. All right, on this podcast, we like to talk about policy and entrepreneurship, but also about what makes successful people like you tick. Tell us, Victor, what are some habits, tactics, and apps that you use every day to stay on top of your game?
All right. So one habit I have is that every day I try to do at least 3 things that are above and beyond what my daily task list is. And I read that somewhere, and what that equals to is like over 1,000 things that you do over the course of a year. And that can be something as simple as trying to extend my social network by asking somebody to be a connection on LinkedIn, or it can be sending you a pitch to come on your podcast. And so I try to do at least 3 things like that a day, so that I always feel like I'm moving forward and broadening my horizons and broadening my potential. And if I've pitched 1,000 things over the course of a year and 980 of them get rejected, that's still 20 opportunities that I had open up based on my effort that could lead to 100 more opportunities. Mm-hmm. So I've been in that mode for a couple years now, where it's just every day making sure that I've done at least 3 things to try to extend where I currently sit. And then as far as apps go, I'm still a pretty simple person. The app that I use that's the most productive for me is my Notes app, and it's to make to-do lists and then also check off to-do lists as I'm accomplishing things. It's very helpful for me to actually lay it out and then see it and actually try to prioritize what my to-do list is on a daily basis.
And tell us the name of a book, Victor, that you read recently that you're recommending to basically, if not everyone you meet who asks you for a book recommendation.
Sure. Well, I've recently read, and I'm a little late to the game, but I've read a number of Malcolm Gladwell books over the last few months. And the one that strikes me as being one that I recommend to people is Outliers. And he really talks about how we define and create success. And one of the main messages I walk away with, or at least that I think people should walk away with, is that success is very much socially constructed. Mm-hmm. And it really talks about how we need to think about, as a society, how we create success and how we can expand creating success so that we allow more people to become successful. Because success is very socially defined and also based on opportunities that people get that are presented through their social situations. Mm-hmm. And so I found it to be very eye-opening and inspirational in that regard, that, we can all play a role in helping other people become successful if we look to where we can lift others up and provide opportunities for them to succeed.
Stability in retirement, I think, is a good benchmark.
Definitely.
But thanks again, Victor, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with the audience before we close? And where can folks find you online?
Sure. Well, my final ideas would just be to say that as far as the alcohol piece goes, I think that, like I said, it's more of an awareness thing. I don't feel like anybody is vindictive or pushing alcohol on people, but the more we can think about the fact that not everybody is one size fits all when it comes to their alcohol consumption, the better off we all can be, because it shouldn't offend you if I don't drink or if somebody else at your party doesn't drink. Mm-hmm. Just think about the fact that, they're trying to be successful in what they do, and possibly staying away from alcohol is one of those things. And then from a user experience perspective, I would just say, really try to think about how the people that you want to consume your information do that, and don't assume the way you consume information or like your information presented is the same as what your users would. And you can find me. I'm on Twitter at Victor Yocco. That's VictorYocco. And my website is victoryocco.com, VictorYocco. And if you search for me on LinkedIn, I would gladly connect with you as well. Or you can also send me an email. Same thing, VictorYocco@gmail.com.
You've been listening to Victor Yocco. Victor is a user experience researcher working for EY Intuitive out of Philadelphia. He's written several articles for the likes of A List Apart and Smashing Magazine, and has recently written a book about user experience research called Design for the Mind, 7 Psychological Principles for Persuasive Design. And I think, Victor, you have a coupon code for that, don't you?
Yes, if you go to my publisher's website, which is Manning Publications, and that's manning.com, MANNING.com, and you purchase Design for the Mind, you can use the code SMAYOCCO, and that'll give you 39% off the cover price of the book, and there's no expiration on that. So again, it's MANNING.com, Manning.com, and the code is SMAYOCCO, and that's 39% off.
Beautiful. Love it. Victor, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
And that concludes episode 44 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. If you like what we do here, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment and head over to iTunes and give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and helps us out tremendously. Thanks again to all of you for listening, and I will see you back here next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.